We're going to look at how to start a frame-by-frame animation from scratch. So let me come over to Photoshop, and we're going to select whatever is the current HD size, which in this case is 1920 by 1080, and the on-screen resolution is 72. And I'll go ahead and create. And when I set up a new animation, I don't automatically have the timeline down here. So this is the time in which I get to choose between video timeline and frame animation. And if you don't have the timeline down here, you can go to Window, Workspace, Motion, or you can simply come down and choose the timeline. And then, as you know, I prefer to have layers and history over here to the side. And then once I have the timeline, I can go ahead and choose frame animation. And before I start drawing, let's take a look at an existing one. So let me come back over to the animated GIF, and I can take any animated GIF off of the internet and bring it down into Photoshop and take a look at how it's structured. So this gives me the opportunity to look at how this was originally animated frame by frame. So if I play this, we'll see what we saw online. But if I click through the timeline, I can begin to see some of the subtle changes that are happening here. So here's where the ink blot idea comes in. You don't need to have a preconceived idea of what it is that you want to accomplish. Just start out with some marks. So in this case, there's some diagonal marks, might be rain, might be something else, and it seems like this little horizontal line down here. Then just decide that you're going to alter something. So this line starts to become a little bit wiggly. Okay, now it's going to become a bump. Now it's a bump and there's a couple other lines. At this point, do not worry about what it's going to become. Just sit there and be with it and ask yourself, okay, I want to make this rise up a little bit more. I'm adding a few stripes. I still have no idea what it's going to become or if it's going to stay purely abstract. Oh, and then an idea came to me, like, okay, maybe I'll add a few other things and it's going to turn into a hand. And then I alter the hand a little bit and maybe I just start deconstructing it and I don't know what it's going to turn into. And then maybe it starts to look like something else. And as the diagonal lines were continuing, I could decide to keep them or slowly phase them out if I want to move away from that. So each time it starts to come into being a new shape, it will eventually start to deconstruct to a place where it's neither one thing nor the other. And then eventually an idea will come. And again, when that idea comes, you don't necessarily have to know what the next final result is going to be. So let me go back to the first frame and go back to my setup animation here. So let me go ahead and set my pressure sensitivity, and you can decide if you want to set your opacity or your airbrush sensitivity. And I'll just draw a few diagonal lines. If you're having a hard time getting started, just hand your graphics tablet off to someone else and just tell them to make a few lines. Okay, so I have my first frame, and this is my background layer. I'm going to double click it to unlock it. Okay. Now I'm going to add a new layer to this. So I can do that down here on the Layers palette, or I can start to use hotkeys. So I'm going to use Shift, Command, and the letter N. So I have one hand on Shift and Command, and then the other hand I type N. And that brings up a new layer. And I'm going to say OK. So now I have a layer underneath and a layer on top. The layer underneath, if I want to reduce the opacity, I'm going to temporarily come out of the brush tool. So again, you're going to want to start to learn hotkeys. So the brush tool hotkey is B, and the move tool is V. So let me just type in V and I go to the move tool, and then I can type in a 5 or a 6 to reduce the opacity of that first layer. What happens is that if I stay in the brush tool and I type in 5, I've actually just changed the opacity of the brush itself, and that I don't want to do in this case. So that's the reason to type in V, go to the move tool, then I can just type 5 on my keyboard, and then I type B and I get back to the brush tool. Then I'm going to lock that bottom layer and come up to the next layer, and I'm going to alter my drawing a little bit. Again, I don't have to know exactly what's going to change, but maybe I start to change the emphasis on something. So here I'm going to kind of go with what the previous student drawing was doing. Then I can turn off that bottom layer, type in V, type in 5, then Shift Command N, and I can type in return. And now I'm on that new layer, and I type B to get back to the brush tool. Maybe I decide I want to move these lines a little bit more. And then maybe I start to add something to it. Okay, I'm going to turn off that layer underneath, V, 5, B, and then Shift Command N. So it becomes, and then return. So it becomes a little bit like playing a musical instrument or playing a sport. So I'm going to maybe draw that line. Then I'm deciding on what it is that I'm beginning to alter. Okay, here we go through it again. I'm going to select that bottom layer. I should actually go ahead and lock these layers, just to be safe. Select that layer, V, 5, B, Shift Command N. Okay. Always make sure that you're on this top layer. At this point I could go ahead and lock that layer underneath, just to be extra careful. And one thing to keep in mind is that once you start to get this animation moving, you can always come back later on and add more detail. So let's say I had this little sort of little hill here growing. Later I decide I want to have a line kind of move across here. I can come back and frame by frame I can add an additional element. So at this point let me go ahead and test out this animation. So I'm going to go to Make Frames from Layers, and I'm going to hold down Shift and select all of these. You can also do if I don't have them selected, then you can go to the pop-up and go to Select All Frames. Then I'll change the timing on this to 0.1, change this to Forever, and go ahead and play. Okay, maybe that could go a little bit faster. Okay, so it's going to take a while to build it up to something that's really working. There must be some glitch in my software that's making this play a little bit slow, but you get the idea. And then after you've gotten the initial animation built, then we can come back and think about color. The animation that you just saw over here, that was actually just an inversion. So all of the layers were taken, and then Command I was typed in, and I'd have to unlock it. Command I was typed in, and then it was the color was just inverted. For some reason that's not working, but it should then invert it to white line on black. So one thing I recommend is that maybe you go ahead and go to some of these other animations and drag them into Photoshop, so that you can take a look at them on the timeline and just get a little bit of an idea of how other students have worked.